If you use PaintScout and you invoice customers in PaintScout, you need to watch this video because there are some really serious pitfalls that either your team can get into or your finance department can get into when invoicing clients after you have change orders on the project. So if you use PaintScout and you're invoicing in it, this video is for you. If you've considered using invoicing, you might want to watch this before turning that invoicing feature on. I hope you enjoy this video. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Chris. I am the owner of Boolean Automation, where our mission is to free you up to do what you love. We have an amazing team of people that work specifically with painting companies to map out which tech stack is right for your business, help you identify the correct softwares, get all of those softwares talking to each other, map out how data needs to flow in your business, and then we start automating everything. We typically are able to automate 80% of the tasks that happen in a painting business. This is no easy feat, but it is transformative to a business to allow you to do more with less. You get better reporting so you can make better decisions on your marketing, on which projects are making you money, which projects are losing you money. But that's what we do here at Boolean. So if you're interested in chatting, you can find more information in the link below. Otherwise, let's get into this video on invoicing in PaintScout. First thing is, there is underneath the invoice settings here, there is a toggle that says automatically generate an invoice when an estimate is accepted. That sounds great. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And I also want to include a due date for 1 day from now. So we're going to go ahead and save those changes. Now I want to jump into an estimate that I have here. And by the way, before we do anything, I do want to point out that in the background, what I have done to help explain this, explain the various things better, I've created several different PaintScout triggers inside of Zapier, and we're going to be logging the results of these triggers to this Google Sheet here, so that we can pay attention to what's going on, how things are coming in, and all that stuff as we do that. So what I've done here is I have set up several different triggers. We're going to be looking at the additional work triggers, the quote sent trigger, the invoice sent trigger, additional work accepted trigger, and then the quote accepted trigger. So we've got a bunch of different things that we're monitoring. And what I want to show you is how invoices can really, if you don't know what you're doing, can be pretty confusing in the grand scheme of things. So what I have here is a quote that I have created to start out. And what I'm going to do first is, everything's already in here. I'm going to make sure that I have a couple, some materials selected. So I'm just going to throw in some Sherwin-Williams, $50 a gallon, confirm. All right, so now I've got some materials on this quote here. Let's go ahead and save. And now I'm going to send. So the first thing that I'm doing as I'm sending this is I would expect the quote sent trigger to fire. So we're going to go ahead and do this. And each of these things takes about 60 seconds for it to process. So we're going to wait a minute, and shortly we will see the quote sent trigger populate this information here. And again, if we go back and look at the quote that we have sent, it was this one here, which is quote number 14. I'm going to get rid of this quote number 2. All right, so we have quote number 14 that we just sent, and we want to see, there it is. It came in here. We have our labor, materials is 132, 66 hours, no additional work yet. And here's our work order link. So if I click on this, I can open up and see, going to be redirected to the PaintScout work order. Everything looks great, right? Okay, so now let's say the customer accepts that. So if I go in and click preview and accept, I accept this. Now, what I would expect to see is the updated trigger to fire for the quote accepted. And the thing to remember about the quote accepted trigger is that it triggers when the status changes. So the status was previously sent, it just went to accepted. That would be a change in the status to accepted. And so that would fire because the status changed to accepted. So that's going to go. But if you have additional work that's accepted in the future, it's not going to fire, or this particular trigger is not going to fire. So you need to be accounting for that. But what I just did in the invoices, if you remember, was I turned on in the settings, I automatically want to create an invoice when I send when the quote is accepted. So now, because I just accepted this, I can go see that there's an invoice already generated and it's in the draft state. I'm going to go look at this spreadsheet here, and you can see that at first the quote sent trigger fired, now the quote accepted trigger fired. And if I look at the work order here, still the exact same work order, that's fine. Everything is as expected, right? So now I want to send the invoice to someone. So I'm going to go ahead and click send invoice, and I'm going to put in my email again. And so now the invoice is sent. So again, nothing has changed. So no issues as long as there's no change after the quote is accepted so far. But what's going to happen here, which is a really big deal if you're not aware of this, is the way that PaintScout manages quotes and invoices is it treats the quote basically as something that is accepted one time, and then it clones everything on the quote and turns that into an invoice. And now the invoice itself is essentially a living version of the quote, which is now not tied to the invoice. If that makes any sense at all. It should make more sense in just a second. So now you'll see here that I have the invoice sent trigger, and immediately there's a couple things to note. First of all, the labor and materials are coming across differently in that invoice sent trigger than they did. Let's go find the actual zap here. So invoice sent trigger. I'm going to go in and edit this one and see what's going on in this particular case. So if I go down to test here, I should be able to find that record that was just sent. So here's the record that was just sent. And this was for Darth Vader. So I want to continue as selected record. And we'll jump down to here and see the labor. So the labor price and the materials are now not the same as they were before. And let's go ahead, just double check that I am grabbing the correct one. And this is quote number 14. Sorry, now this is invoice 3. So that's the other thing that's kind of wonky about this is that now quote number 14, it does say this is the parent quote ID, which is 14. That's what we wanted. Do we have the labor in here? It does not look like we do. So let's search for totals. We have our price, hours, after tax, discounts, job address, and there is nothing in here for the labor. So again, minor details here, but there is no labor that's coming through here. There is the URL for the work order, but that's another thing we're going to talk about in just a second. So this zap is set up correctly, like it should be. But what I want to point out is you'll notice the labor and materials aren't coming over anymore. The other problem is that notice this URL, the URL is now different. So before this was the quote work order. Now we have an invoice work order. And you might think, well, who cares? What's the difference between the two things? And I'm going to open up both of them and show them to you side by side. And right now, there's no issue because of this. So I'm going to dive into, let's look here. Our total hours is 66.5, total hours is 66.5, whatever. This is where it can be very dangerous if you don't pay attention to what you're doing here. But because I just sent the invoice, I can now go back to, we're going to view the estimate, and this estimate is accepted. So two things can happen. First, if I go in to edit the estimate, and this is a super common mistake, let's say I want to add some additional work. I'm going to add a bedroom, walls, and the surface here. I'm going to do that, and we're going to add some materials in, confirm that, add. Okay, so I just added some additional work here. Whoops, I meant to add both of these as the option. So we now have this down here. We're going to go ahead and move to additional work. And again, you'd think this is all fine because the original was accepted. Now I've got additional work. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to send. So I go ahead and we're going to send it to myself, Chris. So I'm sending the quote again to the customer. And let's go ahead and pretend that the customer got it. So I'm now going to accept that work. I click accept. And so now there's several different things going on here. First is I just accepted additional work on the proposal. So I should see two things coming through here in just a minute. Here's the additional work accepted. So the additional work accepted trigger fired. The amount that I just sent is now showing up here as well. But the one problem is that now I have, because the additional work was accepted on the proposal, remember, there's two different IDs now. So the challenge here is making sure that you're managing these correctly. And essentially, because I edited the proposal after an invoice was created, now if I open up both of these again, so I'm going to refresh this. On this one, I have 75.5, and this is my proposal work order. On this one, I have 66.5, and this is the one that I'm invoicing. So if you are not aware of this, you could have your estimators making edits to the proposal and the additional work order. The client's accepting it, and it's not showing up on your invoice when you're invoicing the customers. So that's the first thing to be aware of, is that the solution is, if you are invoicing in PaintScout, once the quote is accepted, you should never edit that quote again. And you should only be editing the invoice, because the invoice and work order, the invoice only changes when you edit the invoice, whereas the quote changes whenever you edit the quote, and they're not linked anymore. So they're two totally separate documents at this point. So now I mean, my thought is like, how do you know? How would you know? And there isn't a way to know that your invoice is off. You just would be going back and forth looking at my estimate. And again, it was accepted. The additional work was accepted. I go view the invoice. There's a difference in that. And if I'm not paying close attention, I might invoice the customer thinking that this is the total, and it's not. So that's a really, really big deal to understand. The second big thing to understand is, I'm going to do it the other way. Let's say that I'm looking at the invoice now, and so the customer is paying for something, right? I'm going to go in here, edit the invoice, add a line item, and we're going to do the office. So I'm going to add the office, walls, all that's good. I add the area. Let's say I make sure that I put this on as an option. We're going to do the additional work thing again. So now I go ahead and sign this. So now I am invoicing correctly because I edited the invoice. But big mistake that you can fall into is, if you sent over the quote to your project management system, or if your crew is looking at the proposal work order, not the invoice work order, they're going to not be doing work that the customer is expecting that they're getting, because the crew is looking at the proposal work order, whereas the invoice work order is what needs to be created. This is very, very confusing. I don't know why PaintScout did it the way that they did. I'm just trying to help you navigate the differences between these two, because if you do understand the difference, it actually does, like, you can work it out relatively simply with just planning. But I just want to make sure this is super clear. You can see in this case, it's all the same proposal and invoice. It says quote number, but this is actually invoice 3, which is tied to quote 14. And you can see that I have $292 of additional work accepted on the invoice and $639 accepted on the proposal. Which one's correct? I mean, yeah, I don't know. It depends what one was supposed to be. And again, if you look at these, you'll see that there's a discrepancy between this one saying now 71 hours. And if I look at this one's going to say 75 hours. So all that being said, here's what you need to know to navigate this correctly. The first is, if you are invoicing in PaintScout, this is when it applies to you. If you're not invoicing in PaintScout, then there's this complexity doesn't affect you at all. But if you're invoicing in PaintScout, you need to make sure that once the quote is accepted, you're only dealing with the invoice for everything. And that means that even the work order, you should not be using the proposal work order. You need to be using the invoice work order, because that's where all changes need to be made. And that's what's going to be accurate. That's also going to be how you're correctly invoicing the client for the work that you've done for them. So a lot of detailed information, very, very specific. Hopefully that made sense. If you have questions, you're still like, maybe I shouldn't use PaintScout. That's not what I'm saying. It's just complicated. And you got to make sure that you're mapping, if you're using Zapier, that you're strategically picking which triggers are the right triggers to use to make sure that you are having that data flow into your CRM the correct way. So if you need help navigating that, we'd be happy to chat. You can grab a time down below. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Chris. This is Boolean. We free you up to do what you love, and we will see you in the next video.